Welcome to California Wine Institute's Behind the Wines with our host, Elaine Chukan Brown. Thank you all for taking the time out to be with us today. Now, during the busiest and most exciting time of the year, when the grapes come in for harvest, Elaine continues to guide conversations with leading figures behind some of California's most seminal wineries to learn how they have changed perceptions of California wine, established unknown regions, and raised standards to build California's profile as one of the world's top wine regions. They haven't done that in an isolated context. They have been heavily influenced by other great wine regions like Burgundy or Bordeaux, and in turn, they have helped shift viticulture and winemaking practices in those historic areas. This chapter aims to illustrate how the world has changed California and how California has changed the world. Today, we welcome Cory Empting of Harlan Estate. So before we get started, some housekeeping reminders for everyone. During the webinar, note that there are two communication methods available. There's a chat section as well as a Q&A section. So these are different. The chat section is an informal way for you to communicate with other participants. Be sure to select everyone in the to field as it can default to panelists only. Then there's the Q&A section, and this is where we'd like you to submit your questions for Elaine and Cory to answer during the webinar. We will do our best to address your questions, and for those that are not answered live, we will provide a Q&A summary in the email you'll receive following the program. Now I'd like to introduce our host, Elaine. In addition to writing for her own site, Waka Waka Wine Reviews, she serves as American Specialist for JancysRobinson.com and contributes to a long list of respected publications. She contributed to the 8th edition of the World Atlas of Wine, which has won multiple awards very recently, as well as the award-winning 4th edition of the Oxford Companion to Wine. She was named by the International Wine and Spirits Competition and Vinitaly as one of the world's top 5 wine communicators of the year for the last 2 years in a row. And Cory. Cory is a native of the Napa Valley. He got into the wine business at an early age of 15. At university, he served as harvest intern at Harlan Estate and BOND, and has also worked in cellars in various wine growing regions in Europe and around the world. In 2007, Cory was appointed winemaker of Harlan Estate and BOND, and has now extended his winemaking expertise to Bill Harlan's most recent wine venture, Promontory. Now, Elaine, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katie. I really want to thank everyone there's so many diligent viewers that have, many of you have actually attended every single episode of this series, and I really want to thank you. And I try to mention different groups or different countries that have been viewing the series or tuning in during the different episodes. And so today I'd really like to especially give a shout out to Canada. There's this very dedicated pack of you that sign on every week, and I really appreciate your being here. So thank you, and hello to everyone all over the world and all over the country today. But especially Cory, thank you so much for being with us, making time today.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Well, and I want to make sure to mention, it's a very unique and special treat for you to make time for us in this way. It's actually unusual for you to be willing to do an interview of this sort, and for Harlan to do interviews of this sort. So I really thank you for trusting us and being willing to share your insights today.
Once again, my pleasure. And I think it's, the commitment to do it was based on, I think, the amount of interest that you showed and the time that you're willing to invest to understand all the things that we're working on. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I want to let our viewers know that we are in Napa Valley today, and the truth is that California has entered fire season, and so Napa Valley is actually experiencing rolling blackouts. So power outages. It's one of the ways to kind of conserve energy during heat waves like we have now and during fire season. And so while we do not anticipate having any issues today, it's obviously something that we can't control. So if something inadvertently happens, I just am giving you a heads up that's what's behind it. So please forgive us dealing with the reality of life in California. Cory, one of the things I'm really quite excited to talk with you about is you know, Harlan's primary commitment, as I understand it, is to wine growing. And a lot of times in wine conversations, we talk about winemaking. But I know for you and for Harlan, wine growing is really the primary interest. And in my time walking vineyards with you, seeing the dedication to truly regenerative agriculture really stuck out to me. And at Harlan, I see you and your team making efforts in the vineyard that, to be honest, I haven't seen anywhere else. And I get to walk vineyards all over the world. You know, you've done a significant amount of work in reducing water use while increasing vine health. You know, the Harlan team is really committed to doing whatever it can to preserve vines, to reduce the need to replant. So, you know, to encourage, you know, older vine health as well. And I know that you actually work with, part of how you accomplish this is sort of twofold. You bring in outside experts on all different aspects of kind of soil health, water use, regenerative agriculture, vineyards, from all over the world, but you also are able to travel to different estates to see how other people are working all over the world. Could you sort of talk to us about examples of what you are literally doing in the vineyard, but also just sort of the perspective you bring in getting that outside influence and thinking through how to work with your specific site?
Sure. I mean, I think to approach that question, I think kind of backing up a little bit, I think that mostly for me, there was something, you know, as a young person, I was really passionate about wine. I knew I wanted to dedicate at a fairly high level, but this was all kind of pretty nebulous until I showed up on this property. And I think stepping foot on this property, there's a certain sense of home, a certain sense of grounding that I think is really important. When you talk about techniques and you talk about a lot of the things that we're working on, in a lot of ways, I think they're the path to get closer to where we want to go in the long run. And so to talk about them kind of in isolation, we miss out on really why we're doing the things that we're doing. So I think there's a certain sensibility of this place. There's a lot of intuitive and logical reasons that Bill found this place. But for me and you know, now almost 3 generations of us, it's home, and it's our teacher, and it's a place for us to reflect and contemplate. So I think one of the earlier moments was that we're trying to express what this place, you know, in our sense, like the meaning that this place has to offer, that we feel intuitively, but we struggle to express. And I think we see it as our life's work over generations to really get closer to that. And so to your point earlier, vine age was a key component of that. How do we create something, because we know we're not going to accomplish everything in my lifetime or even the next generation's lifetime, and so on and so forth. So how do we build a foundation that 100 years, 200 years from now, that we're increasing the vitality of the site and leaving it in a better place than we inherited it? And so that's kind of my big build up to get back to your question. Sorry about that. But, you know, vine age, I think, is one of the best ways to express what a place has to offer. And I think that's important because vines gain wisdom over time. As their roots react to different growing seasons, they tend to build up more and more ability to withstand and also to dive deeper into the soil. And so many of our practices are based on that just kind of fundamental belief that if we can have healthy vines that get older, we should more naturally be able to express what this little nook of Western Oakville has to offer the world. So dry farming, you know, reducing our needs, kind of eliminating fertilizer, trying to get rid of compost, trying to create natural cycles that will allow us to have to intervene less, but when we intervene, really do the timing. I mean, really think more about timing and about what we choose to do rather than doing more and more and more. So examples of this that have taken, I don't know, decades of kind of trial and error and research and development of all the different generations is ways in which we can kind of look into the forest, look into the surrounding environments for how do we bring some of these elements into the vineyard. You know, trees put out a huge degree of mulch and other items that help insulate the soil and help, kind of allow the microflora to do their processes. How can we bring some of these mulching elements? Because so many of our practices is the elimination historically of things from the vineyard. So, an example is we started mulching using the canes and creating kind of a vapor barrier to allow the soil temperature to stay the same temperature and reduce evaporation from the soil surface. But that was really superficial in a lot of ways. So really the next step of that was, how do we get plants to be more part of this ecosystem where we have pretty dry seasons? And so we brought in a host of different cover crops, because really when you think about it, what we needed to do is return carbon to the environment. And we always look to forests, but forests aren't actually as carbon rich as you'd imagine. It's actually the prairie lands in the Midwest are actually some of the most fertile, high in organic matter soils. And that's because you have these grasses that are photosynthesizing and depositing carbon into the ground. So this seemed like a much more natural way. We don't have to drag a bunch of materials into the field. We just need to be able to be custodians of the natural kind of annuals and perennials that grow here, and really pay attention to them and work on their survival and their ability to thrive in this environment. And we get twofold. We get an insulation of the soil and a moderating of temperature because of kind of the respiration and photosynthetic activity of the plants, but we also get this light energy and carbon dioxide being converted into carbon that is invested into the soil. And there's crazy facts like if you can increase soil carbon by 1%, you can increase the water holding capacity by 16,000 liters per hectare.
Yeah.
And something that you can change soil carbon in the magnitude of 2 to 3%, but or even more over time. But that's without cultivating, without bringing anything in, just letting plants do what they do. And so I think that's just an example of, these things are iterations. They're all focused on the vine health and the ability for this property to continue forward, but we're trying to find ways that we don't have to be doing all of this work and be occupied with kind of these tons of little things that we're adding. How do we take advantage of kind of these macro cycles that we see nature providing?
Yeah, I so appreciate what you're describing, because there's, the last 10 or so years, there's been this large, macro level movement in wine talking about this idea of low intervention or non-intervention. But one of the first things you pointed out was that, there are, of course, ways we must intervene, that, to have a vineyard at all is an intervention. But part of your point is that you can shift what interventions are needed by looking at when something's needed, but also by understanding the vineyard. It's a really profound shift of perspective too, by shifting, instead of thinking of the vineyard as its own thing, instead thinking of the vineyard as part of an overall ecosystem. So a much more holistic view. Suddenly you get to incorporate the surrounding forest. It also, I know, assists with pest management in different ways, bug management. And your point about, by not tilling the soil, by not digging up the soil between the vine rows, you actually can increase water holding capacity, reduce erosion, lower soil temperature, which kind of evens out the ripening arc of the vine as well in some sense, and helps, as you were saying, preserve the sort of air bubble, so to speak, the respiration bubble around the vines as well. And I want to actually highlight the point you made too, that studies, historically we've thought, we have to preserve our forests to combat climate change. And that's absolutely true. But one of the things we've discovered in the last several years is actually grasses that are allowed to grow and develop in age are one of the biggest carbon reserve plants on the planet, but we've been steadily digging up our grasses. So actually vineyards can assist to some degree in combating climate change by actually just helping to cultivate cover crops and grasses that stay through the year rather than get moved around and tilled up. So it's really quite amazing. So it's a way of thinking of the vineyard as a holistic part of the ecosystem, but also vineyards as a holistic part of overall earth health or agricultural practices. It's really it's an important shift. One of the things I would think we should do, I get so excited thinking through these things with you that it's easy for me to race away in the conversation. And I think we should be sure to take a moment to show everybody where we're talking about. You know, we are, as I mentioned, we are of course in Napa Valley. And if Katie could show us the maps that she's made, we're actually more specifically in the hills of Oakville. So on the western side of Oakville. So here, of course, Katie's shown a box that we're about to zoom into this area, obviously north of San Francisco, north of San Francisco Bay. We come into Napa Valley. So here's, of course, the north coast. The red line there demarcates the Napa Valley AVA, and then there's a series of sub-AVAs within Napa Valley. We've marked off just a couple that are relevant to this conversation. And then as we zoom in even closer, we come into, again, the red line shows the perimeter of the Napa Valley AVA. The green here, though, is the perimeter of the Oakville AVA. And you'll notice that Harlan Estate is located all the way on the western boundary of the Oakville AVA and properly situated in the hills themselves. And so that is the Mayacamas range. And one of the things that's interesting about the site as well is that it's actually an intersection zone where the volcanic material coming from sort of the Mount Veeder area actually intersects with sedimentary uplift, so that the vineyards here are planted both in volcanic and sedimentary soils. I think a lot of people don't realize that's possible here in the Mayacamas.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, you know, I mean, this area of Oakville, Bill was originally drawn to because, you know, Napa is one of the few places in the world when you head south, you're actually getting to a cooler climate because you're closer to the San Francisco Bay. And so you have this kind of temperature, humidity flux that happens on a daily basis, but also being in the Western Hills, you get this kind of afternoon shade that naturally occurs as the sun sets over the Mayacamas. So it's a pretty interesting nook. And the fact that we're surrounded by kind of woodlands and forest, it's kind of a little tucked away spot on these Western hillsides.
Right, and we went ahead and brought a photo of part of the estate as well. And I think this is such a beautiful example of how the vines really are surrounded by forest. Forest actually helps, you know, any kind of forest kind of helps create its own microclimate, which changes, sort of makes an evener ripening arc. You'll notice there on the upper right that we're facing north, that's Mount St. Helena. And you can see the vineyards are really sloped. And what we're looking at here is actually the oldest block on the vineyard, planted in the mid-1980s, which you do still use as sort of the heart of Harlan Estate.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, Bill, you see the terraces at the time. Bill had visited all these kind of Sri Lankan tea plantations and was one of the only vineyards that I know of where he actually planted exactly on the contour. So it kind of almost reads like a topo map when you look at it. It's a bit hypnotic. And though we've moved to kind of planting up and down the hill, there's something special about this place. It's a management nightmare in some sense because the exposure changes around the hill, but it's so much of our identity and so much of what the estate is that I don't think we'll ever plan to change it, at least in our generation.
The other thing that's important about this photo, of course, is you can see the fog layer really settles into this area, even as it is on the hillsides, on the slopes, that it is actually still at an elevation where fog plays an important cooling influence for the vineyard as well. So I want us to keep talking about wine growing, but I think as we go, we should sort of talk about the wines within the conversation as well. And you were kind enough to bring 3 wines. So today we're going to talk about the 2010 vintage, 2016 vintage, which is current release. And we're also, for the first time in the history of Harlan, going to do an on-camera preview tasting of the 2018 as a barrel sample, which I'm really thrilled about. But let's go ahead and start with 2010. I know for you, the way you've described it to me, there was a really important kind of shift in understanding for you of the vineyard and how to work with it. And that you saw kind of an incremental change in your understanding in 2010. So could you speak to us just about, what is it about the 2010 vintage that was so significant?
Yeah, I think looking in the rearview mirror on 2010, it seems like it was a natural During the growing season, it didn't feel like that at all. It felt like we had this really short window to mature the fruit. It was one of the coolest years, I think, very close to 1998 as far as temperature accumulation. And there was a feeling like we just had a really short runway. So we were pretty draconian about thinning and keeping things down. We had one little heat spike, but other than that, it was a very cool season with kind of, growing up here, I always knew by Halloween, generally it's raining on Halloween. So as we approached October, we knew we had kind of limited time to bring things in. And so when we brought the fruit in, I remember thinking, wow, this is going to be a real challenge. And tasting the wines, I was like, wow, this is extremely compelling. There was this lively acidity, but there was no lack of density or depth to the wine. They were really dark and profound, but not heavy. And so I think it really changed my idea of what ideal was, because before that we had proceeded kind of pretty, 2001 to 2004 were generally warmer vintages. 05 to 09 were more temperate, but 10 was kind of the first cool vintage we had. And I always had this idea that we needed a certain degree of warmth to get ripeness, but 10 showed me that you don't, if anything, we have plenty of ripeness here on a vintage where I expected it to be, much leaner, much greener. And so there was a certain, I don't know, I guess from 10 and then subsequently 11, which were both cool vintages, and 11 definitely more challenging, there was a certain reverence for the site that grew in a huge way for me. I think this place showed me that you don't have to, it's not so much about the human element always. You can kind of sit back and you can trust in the vines that they have lived through, from 1980 until now, and they have an understanding of what they can and can't do. And there's a certain amount of trust we have to have in them. So I think that was a huge learning for me from 10 and 11.
Yeah, your point about, I think sometimes people forget because of the unusual weather in 2010, and it being cooler for the most part, that actually means the vines have to hurry up and get things ripe. Sometimes we forget that when we're talking about a cold vintage, it often means a shorter ripening window. And the thing about tasting the 2010 now, there's absolutely no hint of green there. Like, it does have one of the elements that I so appreciate about Harlan Estate. There's always a sort of what I think of as mountainous, resinous forest notes or resinous herbs. There's that for me makes it feel really authentic to its place, because it is surrounded by these classic Northern California forests, mixed forest, and so there's definitely that kind of resinous herb or mountain forest element, but no sense of greenness in terms of underripeness at all. And in fact, 10, like the natural tones and flavors of the wine actually are very deep and dark, and yet the wine is also lifted, and there's no sense of heaviness at all. There's really a freshness. My palate is still lit up and very stimulated, and the other thing about this 10, like, I think if I was blinded on this wine, I'd really have a hard time claiming it was 10 years old. There's a sense in which the only reason I might understand it has some age is because I have been lucky enough to taste a lot of other Harlan wines, and so, but it's really, this wine, it's going to age an incredibly long time, and the tannin presence is significant, yet relatively fine at the same time. And that's an interesting tension too.
Yeah, I think that, this has always been kind of a favorite of mine, but I think you made the comment when you were here, which I just like immediately identified with. It's kind of like the introvert in the corner of the room that, is really interesting, but there is like the tannin create a certain fortification. And for me, it's undeniable that the tannins are fine and that it will come with age, but there's a certain excitement for me because it's got that tension. It's got that kind of, the coil's a little bit tighter and it just needs time to relax. But I think it's always, I don't know, there's these vintages where you just kind of smile to yourself and that they're a little bit tannic, but it's the right tannin and you've seen enough of them to know where they go. And so it's kind of a fun one to wait on and see where it goes.
It feels like what I would call noble tannin, that in the sense that it's certainly abundant, there's plenty of it, but it feels in sync with with the wine. It feels right for the wine. There's absolutely no astringency or even angularity. It's like the tannin is at home in the wine. So going back to wine growing though, one of the things that I appreciate that you've started actually is, you have a very unique perspective on what kind of labor amounts to. And I think it's actually especially important in relation to the vineyard side. My understanding is your commitment is that, vineyard labor is often thought of as backbreaking and really difficult. And oftentimes, agricultural workers are sort of perceived as they're just there to get it done. But actually, with the kind of commitment you have to quality in wine growing, your perspective has been that the vineyard work does need to get done, but should never be backbreaking. There should still be time to reflect and time to grow in one's understanding of the vineyard. And so you've actually approached this through kind of shifting sort of the time schedule, so to speak, around how vineyard work is handled, but also by creating a mentorship program for people that work in the vineyards there. So could you talk to us just about your Vine Masters program and how that fits into the overall view there at Harlan for you?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a program that I would love to take a bow and take all the credit for. But like many of the things here, they kind of start with ideas, and to see them through really takes a coordination of everybody. Bill has set the tone in a lot of ways, and Will, I think, to understand, Will's a philosophy major, and so he's very philosophical about a lot of these things. And I feel, we're separated by about 7 years. Sometimes I feel like he's my older brother. Sometimes I feel like he's my younger brother. But it's a lot of these ideas kind of started with Bill's always kind of, we have kind of on the calendars like every Friday conversation to talk about philosophy with a close friend of Bill's from London, and Will and a few of us, and we all kind of jump on and off. But it's been a place to kind of reflect. And so there's always been this inherent belief that time for reflection and action, there's a balance between the two of those. And I saw that Bill was really investing in not only my growth as an individual, but also not to sacrifice my mentor's growth, Bob Levy, to allow him to work here alongside of me, seeing the value that is brought by both generations. And I think we all started to focus on the people in the vineyard kind of being maybe one of the more important things, that we needed to think about continuity of that. How do we keep this thing alive? And I think to the points you brought up, we had to address the ability to earn a wage here that they could live by, but we had to address restoring nobility to the work. And part of that was really helping to illuminate how skilled some of these tasks are, how long they take to get to this certain level. It was a huge path of discovery for us, but also I think for the workers to realize, I think in a lot of communities here, you just take someone off the street and then you throw them in the vineyard and they prune alongside people that have been doing it for 10 or 20 years. I think it's demoralizing, because you can imagine if there's like somebody performing surgery in the ER and they said, okay, let's just grab somebody off the street and throw them in here. You might feel like all of that time you spent in education and experience might not be as valuable. So I think we really needed to address that. And we were lucky that we had full-time employees that have been here for a long time. But I think alongside of that, this is kind of where like you and I got into John Ruskin when you were here. And I think there was part of that our society's moved kind of since the Industrial Revolution to separate thinkers from doers. Mm-hmm. And he had a quote that I'll just probably paraphrase, but it's something like, it's only by labor that thought can be made pure. And these things aren't meant to be separated. They're meant to be holistic and cyclical. And I think the dynamic kind of before that historically is that you've got someone in charge of wine growing at Vigneron, and they set the tone and they set the messaging, and everyone else has to kind of get on board. And the degree to which they can follow the exact kind of words of the person in charge is the degree to which they'll be successful. And I think Ruskin, for me, really turned that on its head. I think maybe Bill and Will and everyone else was there before I was, but these people are touching plants on a daily basis. They understand intuitively a language that exists between us and nature. And if we can share the perspective that we have on some of these learnings, we have the ability to learn from them and intuitively evolve beyond kind of our own constraints. And so if we put the burden of the evolution of Harlan Estate on one person or one generation, it just doesn't make any sense. And so I think that was really the inspiration, is we're holding ourselves back because we're not giving these people that are a huge part of what we do the ability to contribute at the level to which they could otherwise. So that really started a chain of events where we needed to create a curriculum with them, with the supervisors, that would help kind of share this knowledge in a way, but also a way to evaluate, which, you know, all of us grew up taking tests and we just hate them and dread them, and you see it as just kind of this superficial thing you have to get through. But I think when you think about it as a way to identify where people need work and they need help, and they see that we come and we try to help them, whether it's through peers mentoring or, you know, perspective that we can lend as to why we're doing the things we're doing. I think it's hugely empowering because they want to be evaluated. They want to understand where they're going. Clearly it's not for everyone. And part of this process, if I told you it was like this Cinderella story of just everything works out perfect, the details are extremely important. And I have to give credit to the kind of youngest generation. You know, well, I always put Mary Marr in the youngest generation, even though she's older than I am, but she's always got that kind of lively spirit. Eli McElroy and Julia Vandervink, I think, really headed up this to put together this curriculum, put together the training, put together the evaluations, and then a series of lectures where we shared a lot of the, you know, fundamentals of soil fertility as we understand it today, the role of microflora, you know, our buddy Paul Stamets trying to get a lot of this kind of fungal community understanding in it. I think we underestimated, I think we thought we'd get a lot out of it. I think we've taken a lot more maybe from them than they've taken from us, because you have to think, and many of them are connected to like kind of the historical way of farming more than the conventional way. So I think it's been great. I think, you know, the other nuance is just that can't be underestimated is that, you know, in a lot of ways people look in agriculture, the only way to move up is to become a supervisor or a tractor driver or something like that. And basically what we've created is a level playing field where a vineyard worker can get paid as much as a supervisor or more. They have very different responsibilities. One is, you know, at the whole point of this kind of mentoring system is that they get to a level of what we call vine masters. And at that point, they become eligible to take on a part of the vineyard and to have it be theirs until the end of their career. And kind of in the sense of kind of, you think about it in the Renaissance, it's like their block becomes their masterpiece, and it's a never-ending masterpiece that they work on for the rest of their lives. And so we don't force them to do that, but naturally they kind of evolve to, we have them walk the property, find the place that resonates with them, and they choose it, and that's theirs. And you know, we've been working on this for a decade, and it's really compelling. I walked these vineyard rows so many times, but I've learned so much about the areas where these people are because they're there every day. They're not there, you know, on a cyclical pattern. They're there every day, and they feel it and they understand it. And our challenge is to connect them with the wine culture, the higher level thoughts, so that they can realize the impact of what they do on a day-to-day basis in the wines that result. So
the thing I think it's been so important in my learning, and I think is really valuable for others to hear in this conversation, is seeing that people that work in the vineyards are they're incredibly knowledgeable. It is a form of expertise. And part of what you're describing is respecting the vineyard team that you have here at Harlan as those sources of knowledge because of their intimacy with the vines themselves. And so a lot of times vineyard workers are treated as people that just need to do what they're told to do. But part of what you're describing is a process of saying, okay, wait, we understand vineyards in this certain way. We're learning about soil health. We're learning about, water, water holding capacity. We're learning about fungal presence or pest management. And so we're actually going to share that knowledge with the vineyard workers, because that can then inform the choices they themselves make in the parts of the vineyard that they have intimate knowledge with. That's actually a really profound perspective that I would love for more people to hear and be able to consider how they can bring in. I know too, though, that kind of that sort of multi-generational kind of relationship and mentoring sort of role that you're describing, it's really foundational to the entire Harlan team. And one of the things that I see at Harlan that, again, I've never seen anywhere else, you kind of intimated, so you've actually been at Harlan 20 years, but Bob Levy, your mentor and colleague, has been at Harlan since before the first vintage was made, that was released. And the two of you actually still work together in a way, very much parallel roles. You have actually overlapping positions, leading wine growing and winemaking there at Harlan, but you work together. That means you have access to a deeper archive of knowledge than you have already yourself with 20 years. But the other thing is you're already in the process of establishing the next generation, still the third person for that same role. So there's actually a kind of interbraiding of generations, all in conversation with each other, one with the full historical perspective, and then at the other end, someone totally fresh-eyed, wait, why do we do it this way? Able to have that conversation to sort of challenge what's taken for granted. But the thing about Harlan, the team, like every core position at Harlan has this sort of multi-generational role. So could you comment on, that connects to how you were describing the perspective behind something like the Vine Masters as well. But could you kind of talk about, what is the importance of that sort of multi-generational practice that you have?
Yeah, I think that probably took me having children to fully embrace what it meant.
Right.
Because I think when you're the younger part of it, I think each generation brings things that the other cannot. And sometimes it's difficult to admit that, and it takes a certain amount of living within that to get there. But, I think you go through these cycles. I think when I showed up here, I felt like I was spending the first 3 years just trying to get at the level of conversation that was being had with Bob. I saw someone willing to turn over every rock in pursuit of a greater understanding and better expression. But I didn't even know how to enter that conversation. And so it really looked at him as this kind of mythical figure. And then, of course, you go through your teenage years where you think you've got it all figured out and that if only you could move a little bit faster in a certain direction. And I think Bill played a pivotal role for that because he was kind of in between us. And I think it was a challenge for Bob to realize that I really cared, but also that, he'd done this thing, from the ground up with very little resources and kind of toiled in a way that I would never have to toil. So I needed to earn that, that privilege. And I think, as time has gone on, you get through that adolescent phase and you look back and it's kind of like, once you become a parent and you look back on your parents, you realize how much they actually did for you when you were young. And I thought, now I realize how much patience Bob had with me, how he was thinking beyond that horizon and allowed me to challenge a lot of things that he held sacred and was open to that. And it really makes you want to in turn turn to the next generation and allow that. I think if I said that there wasn't tension between Bob and I to a oftentimes critical point during periods of our life, I don't think that would be an honest statement, but I think there was a great deal of mutual respect and it's really culminated in, I think, a deeper sense of appreciation than I could have imagined when I began and saw him as this mythical figure. I think I'm kind of beyond that in another way. And then the other thing I realize is that, you know, my expectations for the next generation are extremely high, but they have the ability to tap into Bob. And it's kind of like when you're speaking with Antonoris, it's like, you know, sometimes it was tough to talk to dad, but it was easy to talk to grandpa about these things. And so, you know, I don't want to call Bob a grandfather because he's quite young, but he does have a certain serenity and calmness that I think is really important for that youngest generation to kind of deal with, to digest ideas. And so it's a huge luxury. I mean, it's like every year when we face challenges, to be able to tap into that depth of knowledge, to know that we both share the same kind of spiritual feeling about this place and focused on the same horizon, but with our unique perspectives, it's like the vineyard workers. It gives us a better chance of getting closer to where we want to be. When you can, you know, I definitely have an ego. I definitely have my ideas. I feel strong about them, but to be able to put something that we're working on as greater than either of us as individuals, I think it inspires both of us to continue to do that. So
yeah, no, that's one of the impressions I've consistently had there, is just that sense that everyone I meet that's part of the Harlan team has a strong presence and has a strong personality. Like, each of you are very distinctive people, but there's also this sense that I get from interacting with you, that there's this sense of, I don't know, it's intriguing to me because there's the kind of peace in knowing, I mean, and again, this is an outside impression, but my impression is that there's a peace in knowing you're part of a bigger group. It's not all on your shoulders, but there's also an incredible power in knowing we are all strong people working together, making something far bigger than we could otherwise, or bigger in the sense of more powerful, you know, more, that's pretty incredible. But let's go ahead and look at the 2016 vintage. You know, I think the 16 vintage, from what I understand, reflects a lot of the strength of that being able to work together, mutual understanding. But it also, like 10, my understanding from our conversations is that 16 also represents a sort of incremental increase in understanding for you. And so could you talk to us about what's unique about the 2016 vintage?
2016, it was kind of this, I want to say, fairy tale growing season, you know, kind of typical in the onset, but really distinguished itself with this cooling down of temperatures, huge influence of morning fog that we kind of count on in Napa Valley, but was really present, and it allowed things to kind of gracefully elongate at the end of the season. So there was really an opportunity to pick when we felt was appropriate, but there was kind of this ebb and flow that you felt throughout the growing season, where the human element took the lead a little bit, and then, you know, nature kind of, when we were starting to kind of fall back, nature kind of drove us forward again. So I think kind of the thematic thing for me is 10, I think, was definitely nature taking this leading role and really being a teacher in a lot of ways. And I think 16 was this nice balance between those two. And there's certainly, for me, since the beginning, this wine, just a extremely harmonious play between the elements of this wine. It demonstrates lively acidity, kind of the aromas of the forest around, but then there's this depth, and there's you know, a softness and a roundness and suppleness to it that, you know, I think when we were doing the vertical, I mean, it stands out as having this balance. And so I see it as this kind of natural harmony, if you were, between a lot of the elements at play at the estate.
Yeah, so I was lucky enough there were kind of 5 of us brought in to do a vertical tasting with you and the rest of the Harlan team. And in March, it was actually the last thing I did before stay-at-home orders went into effect, was this deep vertical tasting of Harlan. And we actually were able to taste every commercially released vintage of Harlan ever made, so 1990 through 2016, which, you know, I'm one of very few people in the world that's gotten to do that, it turns out, you know, because it was just that little group. That's the only time you've done a tasting like that, which is incredible. But the reason I bring it up is because, you know, I've gotten to taste the 2016 several times now, and I have to say it's really a remarkable vintage. I think 2016 to be honest, I think 2016 is one of the strongest vintages Napa Valley as a whole has seen in decades. You know, there are absolutely other standout vintages in there in the last couple of decades as well, but 2016 unquestionably is one of the standout vintages in Napa's history, in my mind. And I see that in Harlan as well. And I see it in the sense of it has the hallmarks of a beautiful vintage for the region, but there's also this sort of, the wine, when I taste it, it feels like it has a combination of ease and respect. You know, so it has the harmony of the vintage character. You know, it's a vintage that offered access to the potential for harmony, right? But the harmony is absolutely found in the wine itself, but also there's this way in which it feels, you know, tasting through that full lineup, 1990 to 2016, every vintage of Harlan Estate made. 2016 really did show itself as the culmination of so much diligence, you know, but it turns out the diligence is not only in learning technique or fine-tuning technique, but actually goes to, in my mind, what you mentioned earlier of learning to trust. Oh, we have all these insights. Oh, we have all this technical knowledge. Oh, we know how these things respond. So I'll do what must be done, and yet I will step back and let it happen. You know, and 2016 feels like a wine that honors that to me. You know, which is, it's exciting. It's exciting to see that. You know, I know in that tasting too, I mean, Bill really made a point of commenting that the 2016 stood out to him, and in his mind, it was very much a tribute to the relationship that you and Bob have had, and the careful, thoughtful work you've put in, you know, every year for decades now to carefully understand and reflect and do the work.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, for me, I mean, you think about, I mean, we talked about this, but there's these kind of moments. It's not like every year, I think we like to think that we increase things every year. And I think generally we feel that way, but there are these years where you kind of step up. And I think, you know, 10, then to 16, 16 was a maturation in a sense of this relationship. And it happened to be, I just had children in 15. So I don't think there was a coincidence that I had a little bit more appreciation for everything that Bob brought to the equation.
Yeah. Well, the great thing about having toddlers is you're kind of forced to step back on everything else. Sometimes that works out nicely. But let's go ahead and look at 2018 too. Again, this is a really unique moment in the history of Harlan, and for everybody that's viewing right now, you know, we're actually going to do a live preview tasting of a barrel sample of Harlan Estate 2018, and you haven't, you know, Harlan hasn't actually done that before, and I'm thrilled to get to do that. But tell us about, you know, as we look to the wine, tell us about that vintage. You know, what stands out about it for you?
I think no two seasons are identical, but 16 and 18 share a lot of similarities as far as that dynamic that I mentioned, where we got to harvest and things cooled down. But it was interesting because we had a low amount of rainfall, but the rainfall came really like at a really key moment, because we got almost 9 inches between March, April, and May. And that really helped to kind of set the tone, allow the vines to grow. And then the growing season in Oakville, I don't think we ever crested 100. And I think there was only 2 or 3 days where we were above 90. So, you know, the ability to dry farm stress-free, and, you know, it was just kind of this really synergistic moment. And normally when you get to harvest and you have like the fog rolling in and everything, you kind of calmly kind of move forward. But there was a feeling tasting the grapes, and I can't explain it. And it was kind of an electricity amongst the team that they just felt ready to go. And they were earlier than we probably picked in the past, but the tannin was absolutely chiseled and detailed and vivid. And there was a feeling like, why do we need to wait? The vines weren't telling us they needed to go. Like nothing like on the outside was saying ready to go, but there was like this real confidence, which I can say winemakers during harvest, confidence isn't always our strong suit, you know, a lot of second guessing. But I always say there's a fine line between confidence and hubris, but it just felt really right. And we just got going and we just picked deliberately, and the fermentations were just really effortless, and there was just a joy. I mean, I think every person that went through that vintage, like, we talk so much about the land and the vineyards, but like the human element was just like, we felt the three generations. We felt this energy from the youth of kind of this younger generation, and kind of inspiring, disturbing a little bit. But the wine, for me, like what I really love about it is it somehow has more detail aromatically than even the 16. There's even maybe a finer degree of precision. The tannin and the structure, I think we were talking about it earlier, the details there, you see all the little detail, you feel the tannin, but it's just so fine. You know, I think it's a fun wine. And I think, you know, it's funny how sometimes I lose track of like the weather, but I do remember like these kind of emotional feelings that we share as a team. And there was something really special about kind of being home, being here with the team, and kind of these three generations having more of a celebratory note about a vintage instead of all the kind of worryings about everything.
Yeah, it's the 2018, I have to say, you know, I think it's also a standout vintage for Napa Valley. I think it's still early for, in terms of Cabernet or Cabernet blends, it's still early for us in terms of seeing what the vintage will be. But I will say, I've been able to do quite a bit of early tasting of 2018s, and I've been excited about it from the beginning. There's just this kind of lovely, elegant with presence, you know, with gravitas, elegant and gravitas. Like, it's hard. Sometimes when we say a wine is elegant, we are dismissing it a little bit. Like, what we mean is it's missing something else. But I think that 18, actually, it is so elegant in a way that even more so than 2016. But it still has this incredible, like you said, sense of detail. There's so much precision, but it's relaxed about it. Sometimes precision also means a wine is tight, but in this case, there's this lovely, relaxed, approachable element to the precision. And I even want to say that the 18 feels like it has even more transparency than the 16. That said, the big difference for me is the tannin on the 18 is a totally different tannin character. It's like almost powdery fine tannin, plenty of it. Like, I don't want to imply that it's missing, but because it's definitely palate coating, it fills the palate, but it's powdery fine, really fine feeling. There's something finer boned, still with amplitude about the 18 in my mind.
I mean, we didn't really talk about kind of the ever-present. I think we hinted around it, but, you know, I kind of may seem a little bit off, but the allegorical image on the bottle for me has always been like a guiding light. And there's a certain sense of Harlan that there's always this inherent strength, this inherent kind of generosity and grace with it. And I think it's important to mention in that, because 18 for me, we still have this confidence, we still have this strength, we still have this grace, but definitely in a more transparent profile. And I think when we think about what Harlan brings that we don't find in any other site, it's really important for us that's a contemplation we're constantly having. It's not just like, let's make the best wine we can this year. It's really understanding the nature of this place. And when you walk the roads of the property, they fall on the contours. The people, Bill, who laid everything out, and Bob designing the vineyard, there's a certain ease with which the property unfolds to you, and visually you just feel it in a very, you know, for me, it evokes a very specific feeling, and I don't think I'm the only one that feels that. And that's the projection that we go into harvest thinking, because not every year will give us the same thing, but there's certain things that for us don't change, and that's what we have to respect. Those are the things we have to think about every year when we're picking. I'm not thinking about pH and bricks and just tannins. I'm thinking about this place, this specific part of the vineyard, and it's how they kind of symphonically come together to manifest what we feel, what's evoked from living in this place. So I think it's important. So each one for me, it's like that's where it's being measured against. It's being measured against this ever-changing, ever-growing idea of what we feel about this place. And so 18 for me is fun because we've been able to peel back the onion a little bit, getting closer to like an essence without losing kind of these things that we want to make sure are always present.
The other thing that I really appreciate about the Harlan Estate wines too, there's always this, there's a savory element that's always there. Like there is a backdrop of mixed fruits, but their wines really aren't about fruit. They're there as another element in a constellation of flavors and characteristics, and there's certainly a respect for tannin. The wines are profoundly ageable because of that. Across every vintage we tasted, there was a wonderful wash of acidity and freshness. And of course, there's variation by vintages, but as I mentioned earlier, there's always this sort of almost like a dusty mountain forest with, the resinous herbal element and the sense of, there's always something kind of ferric to it, like a gunmetal or graphite sort of iron element to some small extent. But the thing is, every vintage of the wine has a savory, like kind of undergirding of savory notes that, for me, and I see it especially so in the 18, makes the wine feel digestible. It's something that I hear people in France will talk about whether a wine is digestible, and there's a way in which that's saying, does it agree with your body? But that savory note and the kind of respect for tannin for me make these wines digestible, but I especially see that in the 2018, which again is exciting. It's exciting for me to see a wine of this stature where the team certainly talks about a commitment to incremental improvement over time. But actually, when you spend time with the wines, you see that is true. You see it in the wines themselves. And 18 for me really reflects that. There's absolutely a respect for vintage character and a kind of expression of that incremental, subtle fine tuning as well. I really want to thank you for making so much time today. We are about out of time. And it's really a unique opportunity. This is not something that you usually do. And Harlan doesn't usually do interviews of this in general. And so it's really quite special for you to give us your time in this way and to present these 3 wines for us to talk through and talk about as a way of talking more broadly about your perspective. It's an important perspective and an insightful one. And so, Cory, thank you so much for being willing and for being with us.
Absolutely. I think always, as you know, the hardest part of doing this is that, we are a team of multiple generations and trying not to be the one standing up, taking credit for, the work of everyone else. But it's a huge honor to be able to communicate on these things that kind of we hold sacred, and I appreciate the opportunity.
No, thank you. Thank you again to everyone. I saw some of you shout out, someone mentioned they're viewing from Brazil, and a few other people mentioned they're viewing from Japan, even though it's the middle of the night for you. We of course had people from all over Europe and North America as well. And again, it's really been an honor to bring this series to you every week. And so I thank all of you for making it possible by being with us today. And all the best to everyone.
Great. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Cory. A recording of today's webinar will be published to the California Wine Institute's YouTube channel in the next couple of days, and all of you participants will receive an email with the link. And starting next week, we switch things up again with Behind the Wines, as Elaine begins a series of discussions with leading authorities around the world, bringing a regional focus to our continued exploration of the development of the Golden State's wine industry and its place in the world. So we hope that you will join us next Tuesday, August 25th, to welcome wine writer and author Jane Anson, based in Bordeaux. The session will take place at 10 a.m. Pacific. So thank you all once again.